Caution! This review will work under the assumption that you've already played 9 hours, 9 persons, 9 doors, and Zero Escape Virtue's Last Reward, and will have spoilers for those games unmarked and unwarned. Zero Time Dilemma itself will not be spoiled in any major way during this review. Any notable spoilers will be entirely from publicly shown or disclosed information from Access Games. This has been a long time coming. Zero Escape's third iteration releases in a few measly days across the globe at the time of this review, bringing to an end the cries from Operation Bluebird and the brains of those trying to learn how it possibly could have ended. So let me talk to you about Zero Time Dilemma. I apologise for no video in the background, but the embargo for reviews was 2 minutes of video footage, and this will be a lot longer than that. I'll talk about everything else the game has to offer before I go digging as spoiler-free as possible into the story. First up is the game's presentation. It's been 4 solid years since Virtue's Last Reward, and I'm surprised to report that many strides have been taken, forward and backward. The environments that the game takes place in admittedly feel and look a lot more natural than the previous game, and generally, while nothing's moving, everything looks perfectly fine. Models are notably quite detailed, especially the Zero model, from which I sense cosplay will come eventually. When people start moving though, that's when things get a little shaky. Noticeably, there's not really lip syncing in the normal sense. Characters' mouths open and close with their speech on a repetitive loop, and while it works surprisingly well the majority of the time, it also tends to look unnatural at some points. The most natural character out of the bunch is Q, and surprise surprise, he has no mouth. Some of the other animations that are used to tell the tale are also notably laugh-worthy. While there is one scene in particular where it conveys the emotion trying to be conveyed perfectly, the stiff movement sometimes looks comedic among an entirely serious scene. Honestly though, just sit back and relax and don't look at it too hard. If you aren't trying to criticize it, it'll do the job, even if it looks a tiny bit odd while it's doing it. Notably, the frame rate, at least on the Vita version I'm taking a look at here, tends to drop a bit from time to time in the oddest of places, which is a little bit of a disappointment, but it's a puzzle game with visual novel elements, it really won't get in the way. There's also some strange hair physics bugs that pop up from time to time, especially on Akane, but they're so minor that honestly I'm not entirely sure why I even bring it up. The sound quality remains perfectly fine though. Sound in some Vita games is notable for being extremely compressed and headache-inducing. Zero Time Dilemma does buck the trend though, and it also hangs on to the Japanese voice dub for the Western versions, so even if you don't like the dub, you can always go for the sub. Notably though, there is one exception to this. That's when people are talking inside their own head when they're having thoughts. It kind of sounds like it's coming from down a tunnel. The sub might be a decent option though, if even slightly stilted acting gets in the way of your enjoyment. The voice work in this one is standard dub fare from a smaller studio. It's not terrible and it does the job fine, and they have got all the original voices back, but not what I'd call Oscar-winning work either. Most lines are delivered fine, but when the characters have a notable epiphany or a monologue, it's about 20% chance that it'll feel kind of hammy. Also notable is that the game's initial audio mix is kind of harsh on the ears. The background music is way too loud by default, but you're given sound meters for voice sound effects and music, so you can go and fix that yourself if you feel like it. Just make sure you do though, otherwise you might not be able to hear any of the voices. But speaking of music, Shinji Hosoe, I don't know if I've said that right, is returning for the music, and what's new here is crackin' tunes, including the music you hear in the trailers, and also the track in the room that Polygon showed off in their gameplay being notable standouts. The rest is old stuff with notable remixes of some tracks, and Bluebird Lamentation gets played just enough to get a little old, but you know, it still works. The one thing that disappoints me is that there isn't an epic rendition of the series' main theme this time. It's been excised from the beginning of the game to the roll of the credits, and it's a lightweight piano affair more than anything else. The control method is sort of a port from Virtue's Last Reward, at least on the Vita. You have access to 2 control schemes, one via buttons and one via touch, and the 2 can be combined at will. There are some small shortcomings, like the analog stick control can be a little oversensitive and touching can lead to some accidental mistaps, but most of these can be worked around. You can still do everything with one set or the other, and again, just combining the 2 just works fine. Strangely, the puzzles have taken the most steps back this time around. Much like the previous 2 games, there's no hard time limit, no object you get is a red herring or just particularly useless. You can save anywhere, and there's no easy or hard switch this time, like in Virtue's Last Reward. The game has some of the hardest puzzles in the entire series. Say Bird beats Double Circle to me again, and I'll probably start crying. But there's also a notable introduction of smaller puzzles that repeat multiple times, and let me tell you, these puzzles get old the first time they show up, and they tend to show up about 4 times each. Also notable is that almost every puzzle in the entire game takes place in one room apiece that you stand in the middle of and spin around. While the rooms themselves are quite big and you'll be spending the same amount of time solving them as you would in VLR or 999, it's still something that's worth touching on. Now that I've touched on everything, it's time to get onto the story. And before I even begin, here comes the warning that everyone who knows me is expecting. Despite the fact that Axis and Uchikoshi have said they really want to make this game beginner-friendly, they really kind of failed at it. You really do need to have played the previous 2 games for this one to not only make sense, but to have the most payoff. Previous events are brought up, but in such a small, almost casual way, I honestly thought to myself, if I was a new player, this would be the most contrived BS nonsense I've ever heard in my entire life. Events that would sound crazy and took 2 whole games to be established are passed off in just 1 sentence. It's just weird, really. Like, I can't expect a new player to be able to pick this up and just understand it all immediately. With that said though, let's talk as spoiler-free as possible. Zero Escape is a game series about superhumans who can jump across timelines in order to beat massively complex puzzles, and as a natural progression from the concept of 1 traveller in 999 to 2 travellers in VLR, and now multiple groups working together at once to solve the problem in Zero Time Dilemma, it's about as natural of a progression you can get in terms of upping the stakes. As previously revealed, every character wears a bracelet that wipes their memories every 90 minutes, so the game has a new memory fragment system that allows players until the final stretch to basically drop into random parts of the timelines in order to figure out the puzzle. Notably, this can result in a really boring scene happening or one of the biggest reveals ever happening. And this can really kill the pacing at times. You might end up going through several hours of cutscenes and puzzles before anything interesting gets to happen. To use my playthrough as an example, I saw arguably one of the most shocking scenes in my first fragment, then spent 3 fragments doing puzzles with basically nothing happening story-wise. Sure, when what little mysteries that are left start to pop up, it becomes somewhat interesting. But due to the previous games already setting up what's going to happen here, there's only 1 or 2 things that are left to be found out. And it might bore someone who doesn't know what happened previously and doesn't have the investment to see what happens in this game. The game really needs the driving motivation of the previous games to help you through the majority of this one, and it leans on that crutch just a little bit too much, even for someone who's a fan of the series. If you want me to be perfectly honest, the game honestly turns into a bit of a slog during the first half. If you have the bad luck of getting a bunch of uninteresting segments in a row, it feels like going through the motions in a series that usually turns the idea of going through the motions on its head. Notably, like VLR, there's story locks everywhere, and you have to complete certain events in certain ways in order to extend the story. And it's notably quite easy to miss some of these events or not figure out how to get something done despite the fact the answer's right there in front of your face, and this can add up if you're a bit thick, like me, and get stuck a few times. VLR did suffer from this as well, but it had a fair few less places you could get stuck in place for a while. Then again, if you're relatively smart and relatively lucky, you might not run into this problem at all, so this point might be entirely moot to you. Also new to this iteration are the decision games. Remember how you could get to make choices in the previous games, like what door you could go through or who you could ally and betray with? Yeah, they basically added time limits and randomness to this concept. Sometimes this works perfectly to the intents of the developers. It allows explanations of some scientific principles that wouldn't be possible without those elements, and those segments are actually quite awesome. But the rest of the time, it just returns to things like password entry in VLR, or it's just a simple, somewhat overblown choice. Even worse is when a decision game contains random chance. To get the other option when you're coming back the second time might take a few tries, although thankfully skipping past events is notably quick, and retrying an event won't take more than 30 seconds, but it still slows down the pace a bit, as I made in my previous point. Notably, the flowchart in this game is a lot more simple. In Virtue's Last Reward, most of the decisions you could make would drive you all the way down the tree, and you would get to learn a lot about the situation in the process, and you could follow your decisions all the way to their natural consequences. In Zero Time Dilemma, the majority of these decisions, if made incorrectly, will lead to a game over within the space of a couple of minutes. Don't get me wrong, all of these bad ends have story justification, and it's hard to see how they could have done it differently in hindsight, but it's still notable that there's less endings overall in the game, and this won't change the fact that you might be a little bit bored or upset or something like that while you're playing through these game overs. Despite everything I just said, most of these design choices make a lot of sense in the long run, and the main fun from the storytelling comes from fiddling with the mere concept. An early choice creates multiple timelines that all three teams hop about in via different ways, and the line chart demonstrating who does what resembles a real timey-wimey ball. Much in Uchikoshi fashion, the amount of insanity that's created with the concept is beyond belief, and there's plenty of new elements that really up the stakes. If I call back to my simplified flowchart complaint I just made, if this flowchart got any bigger, it would probably border on Kingdom Hearts level of insanity. It would make me think that the storyline might have stayed engaging all the way through if they'd kept the VLR style of things instead of having the random memory fragments. Also tying into this is the characters. Everybody misses out on depth on this one, whether it's by not really needing it because they're a returning character, or simply not getting too long in the spotlight. Notably, some characters only get a few minutes of monologue to explain their histories or intentions, and one of these monologues comes so far out of left field that it feels really unusual, and it feels that some extra development time has been cut from the game. While everyone does have at least their loose ends tiled up, it still feels a little thin on the ground, and character-focused endings like Virtue's Last Reward would have gone a long way here. Thankfully, a lot of the character development has been helped out by the fact that half the characters were in 2 of the previous games, but it's still just a little bit disappointing. A bunch of the regular minor features of the series return in force as well. Explanations of scientific concepts? You got 'em. Latin phrases? In force. There's like half a dozen in this one. Silly references to the previous games? Yup, or there'd be a lot of apologizing to the fun Yarin Pud to do. Lots of reading material? Oh yeah. Bad jokes? They abound from the usual sources, you gotta be kidding me. Anagrams? There's 3 this time. Despite not exactly matching the previous games in some areas, it still definitely feels like a Zero Escape title. So we're at the end. The game so far, while not exactly excelling in its first half with the character development or timeline diversity, is basically a giant glass window into the huge chessboard set up in the previous 2 games. You've gotten stuck once or twice and pushed through, the boring bits are over, the puzzles are done, the final stretch is ahead, the dominoes start to fall, and the queen goes for the checkmate, and... well, I'll put this as vaguely as I possibly can. Uchikoshi says that this is the end of the series, so one would hope that he could tie up every loose end and answer almost every question that we had. And here's the thing, with a plot as complex as this, the fact that he manages to succeed while still keeping the stakes extremely high, while still adding new stuff to the franchise, and while still making me actually give a damn about what happens, is incredible. The game's last few hours managed to lift me from a relatively depressed slump to a justifiable, tranquil peace. To do that is incredible. Let me just reiterate for effect, everything is tied up. We learn everything about what happens. As a longtime fan of the series who played 999 on DS back in 2010, everything I wanted to know about why this all happened is thoroughly explained, and as an end to the series, I am thoroughly and utterly satisfied with the story of Zero Time Dilemma. While the presentation might be wonky, the puzzles might be a step back, and the first half of the game turns into a bit of a slog, answers to all the questions that I had are worth the effort, and then some. And as far as I can tell, there's pretty much no plot holes, which, again, considering this series, is also amazing. To sum up my views on Zero Time Dilemma, if I knew how to speak Latin, I would probably say something along the lines of perseverance brings satisfaction. I think that's a perfect description of what Zero Time Dilemma is. If you're dying to know how it ends, you will get everything you want as long as you're willing to put in the effort. And to be fair, if you're not as cynical as I am, you'll probably have a really good time on the way there too. I just have one last thing to say. There's a screen at the end of the final roll of the credits that thanks the players of Zero Time Dilemma for making the development of the final installment possible. In return, I want to thank the three teams of developers and Kotaro Uchikoshi personally for engaging me and hundreds of others of players for hours upon hours of amazing storytelling. Like, subscribe, comment, and share the video around if you liked it. I'll see you next time.